As we saw in the previous mini-lecture, the destruction of the temple in 70 CE meant that Jews no longer had a convenient way to deal with sin. They couldn't just transfer their sins to an animal and make a sacrifice to God. In the search for the meaning of sin and trying to figure out what we can do to live good moral lives, the obvious place to begin would be to look at the second part of the second creation story, the one where God creates Adam and Eve separately, and it goes on to say that he placed them in the Garden of Eden and said, you can enjoy all the different food and fruit that's available, but one thing you can't do is don't eat the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. He says, if you eat from that tree, you'll surely die. Now along comes the serpent. The serpent says, don't listen to God. He doesn't know what he's talking about. You're not going to die. He just doesn't want you to eat from this tree because if you gain this ability to distinguish between good and evil, then you'll be kind of like God, and he doesn't want the competition. So he convinces Eve to eat the fruit, and she eats it, and it's delicious, and her eyes are opened, and she convinces Adam afterwards that he should eat. They both eat, and sure enough, of course, God realizes what they've done and expels them from the Garden of Eden, and of course they are now subject to death. Humans will eventually die, and we have all the hard work and toil that we didn't experience in the Garden of Eden. Now, if we think about that from a typical Christian perspective, this story is usually interpreted something like this, that the serpent represents Satan, a figure of pure evil that contrasts with the pure goodness of God, and that Satan therefore tricked humans into eating this, and because they sinned this great original sin, that all humans thereafter are tainted with this terrible sin, and so we need to be saved, and of course Christianity provides a different solution for that with Jesus and his death for the sake of, to atone for the sins of human beings in the same kind of way that the animals that were sacrificed in the temple helped us to atone for the sins that we had done. The Jewish interpretation is quite different. First of all, there's really no Satan kind of figure, though there is a figure named Satan, from which the word Satan comes. But if you look at the Hebrew Bible, especially the book of Job, and see the kind of character that Satan is, or Satan, you'll see that he actually works for God. He's a kind of a prosecutor or a tester. He challenges humans and sees how we respond, and this it becomes a kind of moral challenge for us to deal with the impediments that this figure puts in our way. And so you might think about the role of the serpent in that light, though Jewish interpretation is not universally agreed that the serpent represents even Satan. Maybe the serpent is just a story about how snakes used to have legs and now they don't, because that's what it says in the Bible. The real focus of the story is the question of what happens when humans eat this fruit and now are able to distinguish between good and evil. There's no original sin, because before we knew the distinction between good and evil, how could we have possibly done something that was evil? You have to understand that it is wrong to disobey God in order for that to be a sin. And so it's not understood as the original sin. More importantly, however, it's not understood as some universally bad thing that happened, right? That the kind of fall of man, so to speak, that after we were expelled from the Garden of Eden, and now the world is a terrible, broken place and in need of redemption. Jewish interpretation is quite different. Just as eating the fruit wasn't a sin because we didn't know the distinction between good and evil, the other side of that is that while we now live in a world where there is suffering and where we will eventually die, we did get something important out of the bargain. We got the distinction between good and evil. We can now grapple with these issues for ourselves. And that's the real focus of what the story is about from a Jewish perspective. It goes for this search for meaning, that without the ability to distinguish between good and evil, we would be like animals, just sort of merrily going about our way and sort of, living spontaneous lives, but not moral creatures. You can't have morality if you can't distinguish between good and evil. So in a certain way of thinking, you could say that this expulsion from the Garden of Eden in the Jewish tradition is really regarded as a great blessing. And it's the primary focus that now we can use these tools to think for ourselves and not simply listen to God. Of course, God gives us guidance. We're supposed to pay attention to that. But if we don't grapple with the issues for ourselves, then it's really all meaningless. And so, very important lesson in Judaism that, again, remains very much at the heart of Jewish practice right up to the present day.